How British taxes sparked rebellion. Imagine being told that you must pay more and more money, yet you have absolutely no say in how that money is spent. Imagine your hard-earned wages being drained away to a government across an ocean, a government that does not hear your voice, does not respect your opinion, and does not even recognize your rights. Would you stay silent, or would you rise up? This was the dilemma faced by American colonists in the 18th century. What began as a question of taxes would grow into a question of freedom itself. And in the end, those taxes would spark a revolution that changed the world forever. The aftermath of war. The story begins in the 1760s, with the British Empire victorious after nearly a decade of brutal conflict in the French and Indian War. Britain had secured vast new territories, stretching its power further than ever before. But this victory came at a staggering cost. The empire now faced an enormous war debt, and its leaders looked across the Atlantic toward the colonies as a source of revenue. To British officials, the logic was simple. The war had been fought to defend the colonies, so shouldn't the colonies help pay for it? But to the colonists, who had fought and bled in the war alongside British soldiers, this reasoning seemed insulting. They believed they had already sacrificed enough, and that new taxes imposed from London would trample the freedoms they had come to expect in their own local governments. The Sugar Act and early warning signs. In 1764, Britain passed the Sugar Act, which placed duties on imported sugar, molasses, wine, and other goods. For Parliament, this was just a modest tax. But for American merchants, especially in bustling port cities like Boston and New York, it was a direct threat to their livelihoods. Molasses was essential for making rum, one of the colony's most profitable exports, and the new law came with stricter enforcement against smuggling. The Sugar Act introduced something far more dangerous than higher prices. It signaled a shift in the relationship between Britain and her colonies. For decades, colonists had grown used to a degree of independence in running their own affairs. Now, they saw Britain tightening the leash, and resentment began to spread. The Stamp Act crisis. The following year, Britain escalated matters with the infamous Stamp Act of 1765. For the first time, colonists were required to pay a direct tax on a wide range of printed materials, newspapers, contracts, playing cards, even marriage licenses. Overnight, ordinary people felt the burden of British taxation in their daily lives. To the colonists, this was an outrage. Not because the tax was unbearably high, but because it was passed without their consent. No representative from the colonies had been consulted in Parliament, yet the law reached across the Atlantic and demanded compliance. In taverns and town squares, a powerful phrase began to echo, "No taxation without representation." That slogan captured the heart of the colonial grievance. It was not just about money, it was about the principle of self-government. And for many, it was the moment they began to question Britain's right to rule them at all. Protest turns to action. The Stamp Act lit a fire across the colonies. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods, newspapers published fiery essays, and crowds took to the streets in protest. In Boston, effigies of tax collectors dangled from trees before being burned in public demonstrations. In New York, angry mobs forced officials to resign. Across the colonies, a secretive group known as the Sons of Liberty emerged, dedicated to resisting British authority through intimidation, persuasion, and sometimes violence. What had begun as isolated grumbling now became a coordinated movement of defiance. Ordinary farmers, artisans, merchants, and lawyers, people from all walks of colonial life, found themselves united by a common cause, the defense of their rights. Britain repeals, but strikes back. The wave of protest was so strong that in 1766, Britain repealed the Stamp Act. Celebrations erupted in the colonies, with many believing they had forced Parliament to back down. But Britain was not about to give up so easily. Determined to remind the colonies of who held power, Parliament quickly introduced the Declaratory Act, a chilling statement that asserted Britain's right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The very next year came the Townshend Acts, placing new duties on everyday goods such as glass, paint, paper, and tea. Once again, colonists felt the chains of taxation closing around them. Once again, protests spread, and boycotts of British goods resumed. To enforce the laws, Britain stationed customs officials and even soldiers in colonial cities, transforming places like Boston into powder kegs of resentment. The road to violence. Tensions only grew. In 1770, Boston erupted in violence when British soldiers fired into a crowd of jeering colonists, killing 5. Patriots called it the Boston Massacre, and engravings of the event spread across the colonies like wildfire, fueling anti-British sentiment. Though Parliament repealed most of the Townshend duties soon after, one tax remained, the duty on tea. To Britain, it was a symbol of authority. To the colonies, it was a symbol of tyranny. The Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. In 1773, Britain passed the Tea Act, giving the struggling East India Company the exclusive right to sell tea directly in the colonies at a cheaper price, but with the tax still attached. Britain thought colonists would welcome cheaper tea. Instead, they saw it as a trick, an attempt to make them accept Parliament's right to tax them. In December of that year, Boston became the stage for one of the most iconic acts of protest in American history. Disguised as Mohawk Indians, a group of patriots boarded 3 ships in the harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not just vandalism. It was a bold declaration of defiance, a signal that the colonies would resist Britain's authority with action, not just words. Britain strikes harder. Britain was furious. In 1774, Parliament responded with the Coercive Acts, which the colonists quickly renamed the Intolerable Acts. Boston's harbor was shut down until the destroyed tea was paid for. Massachusetts was placed under direct royal control. Town meetings were restricted, and more British troops arrived to enforce order. Instead of isolating Boston, these harsh measures united the colonies. From Virginia to Pennsylvania, people who had once been indifferent now felt the sting of Britain's heavy hand. Delegates from across the colonies gathered at the First Continental Congress, laying the foundations of a unified resistance. What had once been scattered protests was now becoming a coordinated struggle. The principle of liberty. By now, the fight had gone far beyond taxes. The colonists had come to see the struggle as one for their most basic rights: the right to representation, the right to self-government, the right to live free from tyranny. Every act passed by Parliament, every soldier stationed in their towns, and every tax levied without consent only deepened their conviction that liberty itself was at stake. From fiery speeches in Virginia's House of Burgesses to whispered conversations in small-town taverns, a powerful idea spread, that people had the right to govern themselves. And once that idea took root, it could not be contained. From taxation to revolution. And so, what began as a dispute over taxes became the spark of a revolution. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act, each was intended to raise revenue, but instead, each raised resistance. Each created more unity among the colonies, and each pushed America closer to independence. The cry of no taxation without representation was more than a complaint about unfair taxes. It was the birth of a political philosophy, the seed of a movement that would grow into the fight for independence. Out of taxes came protests, out of protests came rebellion, and out of rebellion came a new nation. The British taxes did not just raise revenue. They raised a revolution,